Welcome, friends. We're coming to you from the Washington, D.C. United Lodge of Theosophists at 9850 Front Rock Road, Manassas, Virginia, 20012. One of the three objects of the Theosophical movement is the study of ancient and modern religions, philosophies, and science, and demonstration of the importance of such study. Today we will highlight ancient Jewish and Hebrew religious manuscripts as found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Next Sunday we will continue our roundtable study of the Ocean of Theosophy on Google Meet. If you're here on Google Meet now, you know that we at the Washington, D.C. United Lodge of Theosophists, as do other ULTs in the world, pass on the path to truth and the ancient message of the wisdom of the ages. Teachings at present, as presented in teachings as presented in religions of the world have a way of losing their purity through human interpretations, a problem that is also held true for theosophy. So Robert Krause restored it to its original lines as it was transmitted to us by H.P. Blavatsky and her staunch colleague, William Q. Judge. Our mission is to make available the message along the lines of what was originally presented to those who find us. The message of theosophy in action has always been before us within the laws of nature. HPV showed the path to perfection, but we must assimilate this message into our daily lives. In this regard, the declaration of the ULT is, and as it was established in 1909, the policy of this lodge is independent devotion to the cause of theosophy without professing attachment to any theosophical organization. It is loyal to the great founders of the theosophical movement, but does not concern itself with dissensions or differences of individual opinion. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and too lofty to leave it the time or inclination to take part in side issues. That work and that end is the dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of theosophy and the exemplification and practice of those principles through a truer realization of the self, a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. It holds that the unassailable basis for union among theosophists, wherever and however situated, is similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching, and therefore has neither constitution, bylaws, nor officers. The sole bond between its associates being that basis. And it aims to disseminate this idea among theosophists in the furtherance of unity. It regards as theosophists all who are engaged in the true service of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization, and it welcomes to its association all those who are in accord with its declared purposes and who desire to fit themselves by study and otherwise to be the better, able to help and teach others. The true theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all. Today's devotional reading comes from the Voice of the Silence, starting on page 27. Yea, ignorance is like unto a closed and airless vessel, the soul a bird shut up within. It warbles not, nor can it stir a feather, but it sunk some mute and torpid sits, and of exhaustion dies. But even ignorance is better than head learning, with no soul wisdom to illuminate and guide it. The seeds of wisdom cannot sprout and grow in airless space. To live and reap experience, the mind needs breadth and depth and points to draw it towards the diamond zone. Seek not those points in Maya's realm, but soar beyond illusions. Search the eternal and the changeless soft, mistrusting fancy's false suggestions. For mind is like a mirror. It gathers dust while it reflects us. It needs the gentle breeze of soul wisdom to brush away the dust of our illusions. Seek a beginner to blend thy mind and soul. Shun ignorance and likewise shun illusion. Avert thy face from moral deceptions. Mistrust thy senses, they are false. But within thy body, the shrine of thy sensations, seek in the impersonal for the eternal man. And having so sought him out, look inward, thou art Buddha. And now for today's talk from the Dead Sea of Scrolls.
Good morning, friends, and I would like to welcome everyone to a concluding talk on Gnosticism and an introductory talk on the next talk that will take place in December on the topic on the true nature of Jesus. And I think at the end of the talk, it will be clear why this is the concluding one on Gnosticism and introductory into the Jesus, because the Gnosticism is really essential to understanding the nature of the Jesus Christ, the way it was presented outside of the Orthodox Christianity. So the last two talks were focused on Gnostic thinkers and Gnostic philosophers and their debate with the Orthodox Christians. Then we focused on Gnostic sects and Gnostic groups across the Middle East and Near East. And today we will talk more specifically about the Dead Sea Scrolls from a historical perspective. We're not going to go into the Gospels themselves. This is a topic of an entire separate talk and conversation. But we will go over the history of the scrolls, and we'll try to maybe both demystify and demystify what is known about the scrolls, because it's a very complex topic, and as usual, the students run out of time of going further in depth, so one can spend a lifetime studying it. Let's go straight to the origin of the Dead Sea Scrolls and their discovery. The Dead Sea Scrolls were located in the various caves in the Qumran, on the shore, in the area of the Dead Sea. There were not one cave; there were actually a number of caves where the scrolls were found. One of the most important discoveries was made in 1947 in the Qumran cave. There are other two caves. There is a Wadi Delaya and Kirbet Mir, where also scrolls were discovered. And the scrolls of a different nature, different timelines. We will cover in the most depth the Qumran scrolls, but we'll also touch on the other ones. They're all coming from same community, same area. So the Qumran was occupied between the year 100 BC and 6770 AD. It was inhabited by various Judaic sectarian groups. One of the sectarian groups was Essenes. Essenes were not Christian in nature. It was an entire separate Judaic sectarian group that lived in the area. In 1947, the Qumran scrolls were found by Bedouins. At times, it's described as an innocent act of discovery, that the Bedouins were going through the caves and discovered the scrolls. The most probable fact is that the Bedouins actually very periodically raided the caves in search for the treasures, very similar to the Egypt and Egyptian tombs and pyramids. And once in a while, they would benefit from some discoveries, sell them on the local and international markets. So that was one of the sort of the usual raids to see what is out there. There is a notion that maybe they discovered it by throwing stones and hearing some hollow sounds inside of the caves. Some other theories go that a sheep that they were walking with went into the caves and they followed them. Most likely, they were looking for the caves. That was one of their sort of lines of business of profiting from the ancient treasure. And once entering the Qumran caves, they discovered 11 clay pots with the scrolls. Something interesting from the more of a personal experience of the student traveling through the area, visited Armenia. That was one of the first Christian nations, and I visited monasteries there. And it is fascinating that the tradition of hiding clay pots with scrolls was also evident there. That in the monasteries, they had an entire openings in the floor, then where they would hide the scrolls from the Persian invaders. So this was not something unique to the Qumran. That was practiced in the Near East in the period. In case of any threat of warfare, the important religious texts, legal texts, were hidden in the clay pots in the ground. So once these scrolls were discovered, they were sold to a number of collectors. And eventually in 1948, they made its way to the American Oriental Research Institute, where they were finally photographed and restored to some semblance of recognition. Some of them were in a very, very bad shape. And in 1949, actually between 48 and 49, the translation took place, and I will talk more about the languages in which scrolls were written. And in 1949 began what is called in the history is the Battle of the Scrolls. This is where the dating was taking place, and it was very hard to date them. So some of the carbon dating was showing that the scrolls are dated to a 7th century AD, what would make them probably less valuable in terms of originality and contribution to the both Old Testament and New Testament. But eventually it was Dr. Albright at the Johns Hopkins University that dated the scrolls at the 1st century AD. And I'm quoting his statement. He, together with the publication of the dating, he wrote that this is notably the greatest manuscript discovery of the modern time. And we will talk more why it is one of the, probably not one of them, but the greatest discovery of manuscripts in the modern time. So going back to the Dead Sea Valley, I'd like to speak now a little bit more of who resided there and the context of the time in which scrolls were deposited in the clay pots. In the 60s, this was, for those interested in history, this is a very important period between 1660 and 70 AD. This was the time of the Jewish revolt and the Roman wars. And this is the decade when the temple was destroyed. So this is the decade when Temple of Jerusalem stopped to exist, when the Roman Empire fully overpowered and destroyed lots of historical significant texts and religious symbols of the Judaism. And it will be logical to see that the community residing at Qumran was attempting to safeguard and preserve the text from the invading Roman armies. So this is the most likelihood why the texts were deposited in the clay pots. There is, in a very close proximity from the Qumran caves, located a monastery. Once again, there is no label or a sign saying whose monastery it was. But from the historical records and most of the records of Pliny, who wrote about the area in his historical records, he was mentioning the Essen community that resided in the vicinity of the Qumran caves and the monastery found near the Qumran caves, because it would be most logical to assume that the residents of the monastery deposited the scriptures in the clay pots in the caves. The Essens at that time were counted at 4,000 across the Palestine and the Dead Sea area. And in the Qumran itself, it could not be more than 140, 150 people residing. So by the archaeological finds of the monastery, it was not a large monastery. Surprisingly, it included women. The Essen community did not recognize marriage and did not marry. They were ascetic. But it did include women. It did appear that women and men lived separately in the monastery. What is also interesting, and this is from the records of Pliny, where he talks that the Essen community did not marry, not have children, but for some reason their numbers did not diminish. The numbers were always replenished. Was it with the new arrivals, with the migration between different Essen communities, would be hard to establish at this time. Something very important about Essens, again, often Essens in connection to the Gnostic Gospels are misconstrued to be a Christian sect. They were not Christian sect, they were Judaic sect. They existed before birth of Christ, about a century before. They have lots of influence by Zoroastrians. So in their practices, they did worship the birth of the sun and sunrise. They had lots of rituals associated with the sunrise. They also had a worship of angels and angelic beings, and that again takes us more to the Persian Zoroastrian beliefs. They were also very connected with therapeutic and influenced by Hellenistic school of thought, and specifically by Pythagoreans. So Essens were really a synthesis of wisdom religion and various branches of the wisdom religion existing at the time. So at the time of the birth of Christ, they did absorb the new teaching into existing philosophies and beliefs that they held, and created a somewhat, I actually debate to say it was a spin on Christianity. It may have been the original thought, Christian thought, that later got lost by the Orthodox Christianity that won the dogma battle, as we discussed in the past talks. But those were the residents of the monastery in most likelihood, and they would be the ones depositing the scrolls. Now, what makes it extremely difficult to determine were they the Essens or someone else is some strange facts that appeared during archaeological days. And those strange facts basically lead to a more and more confusion rather than clarity on who wrote the scrolls. And there are three interesting facts to that regard. The first one is there are a set of scrolls called copper scrolls that were found in the Qumran. And these scrolls, by their text and definitions, clearly belong to Jerusalem. They could never been produced in the Qumran monastery. The school of thought and the expansiveness of the scrolls definitely leads the reader to Jerusalem. So they clearly come from Jerusalem in some way. The scrolls contain conflicting Essen ideas. If the scrolls were produced by the residents of the Essen monastery, they would be more or less uniform, professing the views of the residents. But they have actually conflicting and often contradictory Essen beliefs that shows that it is more of a composite library that came from different places and from different Essen groups. And the fact that all copies of the texts are religious texts. There's less of a secular literature, so it was more of an intent to hide the religious scriptures rather than just preserve all of the relevant documents existing in the monastery. If it would be only the scrolls of the monastery, they most likely would mix up their own both legal documents or any of their sort of operational documentation in the pots. But it was just the scrolls themselves. There was not much of any contractual matter or any account of their monastic life. That was not there. So various historians claim different theories on the who deposited the scrolls. And one of the theories is that actually the scrolls were not hidden by the Essen community at the monastery, but there was an estate of notable Jerusalemite who had access to lots of religious texts and scripts, and he took upon himself to preserve the scripts. More likely, less likely, very hard to say. The other theory goes that, of course, it was an Essen monastery that somehow had a connection to various libraries in the Palestine and was keeping the scripts of various libraries. The third theory, it was a clay-making factory that was making pots, and that was the safest place to deposit the scrolls. So whoever it was chose the location, not because of the monastery, but because there was a pot-making factory, because there were quite high-quality pots that were also possibly produced locally. So maybe it was, location was chosen because of that. But until today, there are debates, and it's not fully clear who deposited the scrolls and how location was chosen. Now, one of the most interesting theories on the topic that was voiced in 1960s, it was not accepted at the time, that was by Professor Rengstorff of University of Munich. But now we're returning to his theory, and his theory was really, I would not exaggerate to say mind-blowing. Maybe that's why it was not accepted in 60s, as there was not enough evidence, but now we're more and more leaning, the more historical research leading that direction, that the Qumran caves and the scrolls that were hidden there was actually a library from the Temple of Jerusalem. That as there was enough evidence that during the Jewish revolt that the Romans are advancing into Jerusalem, a probability of temple being destroyed, every effort was to preserve the library. So the scrolls were moved from the temple into the caves of the Dead Sea. Qumran cave was one of the largest with 11 scrolls. As I've mentioned, there were 2 other caves that had different types of scrolls. Now, Hamari library was actually in one of the other caves in the Dead Sea. But that was a concerted effort by the Jewish religious community to preserve the library of that existed in the Temple of Jerusalem. So if that theory proves true, we would have all the rights to compare the Dead Sea scrolls and the library contained in the caves in the Dead Sea to Alexandrian library. But that will be indeed a great discovery if it would be fully proven from the archaeological and historical perspective that despite the destruction of the temple, what was inside of the temple is now available to us and being preserved, restored, and interpreted. So those are all the theories around who wrote the scrolls and who found the scrolls and how they were dated. But probably the most interesting part would be to look deeper into the scrolls themselves. There is always lots of misconceptions that scrolls are religious texts that are missing from the New Testament, that this is basically the hidden part of Christianity, that there was even conspiracy theories during discovery in 1950s that the Vatican was not releasing the real scrolls, that they're not being publicized. None of this proven to be true, because in fact the Dead Sea Scrolls are only partially Christian. And I say this sort of with a little bit of sarcasm, because in our mind we divide the first century Christianity into the Christianity versus the Judaism or the pagan traditions. In the first century, Christianity was a subsect of Judaism. It was not a separate religion. So when we speak of the Dead Sea Scrolls and what they contain Judaic texts. They contain the Old Testament text and the ideas introduced by Jesus. But it was within the tradition. It was never a separate religious school of thought. So the scrolls contained both secular and religious texts. And I would actually like to take time, and no matter how maybe scrupulous they seem to go over what was there, because it's very important not to confuse the Gospels missing Christian text or any type of esoteric text or any conspiracies of us not having the access to the true Christian text, to actually what was there. There are a number of, actually before we go into the text, it's worth mentioning the languages in which Dead Sea Scrolls were written. And before starting to research yesterday, the student was assured that this probably was Hebrew or Aramaic. It was a great surprise to find that there were 7 or 8 languages in which the Dead Sea Scrolls were written. One of these languages was official Aramaic. And when you look at the official Aramaic, in the time, it was the lingua franca. It was sort of the English of today. This was the language of the Near East, that most of the Near Eastern nations could converse in Aramaic. So official Aramaic would be the language understood by most. Then there was Jewish Palestinian Aramaic. Lots of texts that pertaining to the Old Testament are written in the Jewish Palestinian Aramaic. The other language that is found in the caves is Nabatean. And Nabatean is yet another fascinating twist on Aramaic that includes lots of Arabic dialect. So you see lots of Arabic influence in the Aramaic there, and also specific texts are connected to the writing in Nabatean. Then there's a Christian Palestinian Aramaic, and Christian Palestinian Aramaic was the language adopted by the more of a Christian community residing in Palestine and bringing some Hellenistic language elements in that. There are 27 documents, not a small number, 27 documents of the scrolls written in Greek, and number of scrolls written in Arabic. So just by looking at the languages used in writing, it's clear that in one Essen monastery, the residents could not produce text in all of these languages. It was definitely a composite of many libraries. Once again, was it the library of the Temple of Jerusalem? Was it other libraries? That's yet to be known. But the use of language does show that it was basically a compilation of libraries in the region at that time. And that's what makes the discovery so remarkable, that this is the greatest discovery of a manuscript of a modern time, because it's not just discovery of the scrolls pertaining to Christian beliefs, it's really a discovery of multiple libraries all at once. So this is the languages. Now we will go over the scriptures itself. And it will be fascinating to see the different types of scriptures that are included there. And they go, once again, seamlessly between Judaic tradition, Christian tradition, also Zoroastrian traditions, and different types of purposes. So one of the scrolls is Apocrypha. Apocrypha is the term used for the collection of books that is being used in the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox tradition. Until today, Apocrypha is being used by Catholic Church and by Eastern Orthodox Church. It's not been adopted as part of the Protestant movement and Protestant churches. And several scrolls in the Qumran caves is basically linked to missing pieces of Apocrypha, and this is the book of Tobit and the Epistyle of Jeremiah. The Apocrypha is written both in Hebrew and Aramaic. So this tradition directly links to the Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox Church. The second type of scrolls is completely of a different nature. The second type of scrolls are called calendrical texts. Calendrical texts are basically studies of a solar system and a solar calendar. And here they move from the lunar calendar to the solar calendar. So it's really looking at the breakdown of the calendar, the rituals around the calendar. You can link the calendrical texts both to the Mayan tradition. You can link them also to the Incas, to the Zoroastrian tradition, because it's a very celestial. It's really about astrology and its impact on both agriculture and our observance of mysteries and traditions. So this text, the manuscripts basically have a systematic list of days, months, various mysteries associated with the days and months of the year, and the calendar. Something one probably would not expect in the religious texts of the Jews of the time, but it was there. The third type of texts are called exegetical texts, and exegetical texts are commentaries on the Old Testament, on the Genesis. So the commentaries and a deeper explanation of the story of the Genesis and more of the Judaic tradition. They're written in Hebrew. The next one is quite interesting type of scrolls. It's called Pesher. And Pesher is related just to the monastic community residing in the Qumran. And that monastic community was called Yahad. So Yahad most likely was an Essen community. And the Pesher texts are basically a biblical prophecy about the essence, about the end of days, and about their role in the end of days. One can go deeper in that. Of course, it has lots of end of days connotation, but it also gives some hint to Essen role in preserving the wisdom. So this is quite interesting and very, very localized to the Essens living in the area. Now, when you also look at the essence of the Qumran, one can say they were sort of sub-sectarian of the Essens because they were less traditional than other Essens. There were sort of subgroup of Essens as well. The next text is the historical texts, and historical texts deal with the historical figures and historical periods of the Old Testament. They provide commentaries to the Old Testament, so there's lots of commentaries and further sort of theological interpretation of the Queen Salome, Greek kings, of King Solomon. So it really focuses on historical figures and more of a theological interpretation of events. Yet another scroll contained in those clay jars contained the legal text. And the legal texts pertain to religious law, civil matters, requirements for festivals. And one interesting detail that just notable there, but gives some hints to the latest theory of the fact that maybe the library belongs to the Temple of Jerusalem, it does contain temple services. There is a great detail of temple services and rituals and rites and the regulations around the temple services. So it does seem like there is definitely a connection with the Temple of Jerusalem. It does also describe the rules of behavior. And here it goes from Judaic tradition. There is a mix of legal systems. There is a very Judaic legal system, and then there is a community rule mixed up together with those scrolls. Community rule pertained across the area to Essen communities. The Essen communities regulated themselves with what they call the community rule, and the community rule included not using money. There was no financial exchange among Essens. They lived as a commune, sharing of food, sharing of dwellings, not getting married. So basically, the community rule will define the way Essen community will function. So it's interesting to find that community rule was existing together with a very rigid Judaic legal structure practiced both in Jerusalem and throughout the area of the time. And then there's also something called the halakhic letter that has a polemic with opposing groups. So there we a little bit learn about the polemic between the Essen groups with the others. And that's where there is lots of evidence that the scrolls did not belong to one Essen group. There is lots of differences of opinion. The next set of texts is parabiblical texts. And parabiblical texts are basically retelling the biblical stories and mostly focusing on Genesis, on Enoch, and there's also temple scrolls. There is also Jubilee written in Aramaic. These texts, parabiblical texts, are written in Jewish Aramaic. And there is an entire research of why each scroll belongs to different linguistic group, why it was written in that language and not the other. Then there is a poetic and liturgical text, and poetic texts were more of a personal study text. There were poems, there were hymns that were used probably by the people and families themselves. They are inspirational. There are books of prayers, there are books for various festivals that we actually don't often find in a Christian tradition, but they are associated with the Christian worship. Yet another interesting set of texts is called sapiential texts. Sapiential texts are conveying the wisdom, spiritual wisdom, and there are Proverbs of Job, Ecclesiastes, Psalms. What is interesting about sapiential texts, today we would call them self-help books. That's what the sapiential texts were. That were there to guide people through difficult situations in life, improve themselves, and work on the challenges of both self-perfection and living as a community and contributing to the betterment of the world. So this is the sapiential text. They were less religious, less spiritual. They were very practical. And again, in today's terms, it would be self-help library. Yet another set of texts that is fascinating, and it's an entire, I would say, library of texts. They're called sectarian texts. And sectarian texts are the texts that belong specifically to the Essene community, to a various sects of the Essenes. So they also called the Qumran scrolls of the Essenes. And most of the scrolls in the Qumran caves belong to the Yahad community, Yahad Essene community that resided there. And the scrolls basically discuss both community rule and spiritual beliefs of the Essenes. Some of the scrolls, the names are known of the scrolls, I will quote them. There is a community rule, Serek HaYahad, and there is scroll of the war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. There is also Habakkuk commentary, Pesher Habakkuk. We talked about the Pesher. So Pesher is really the guidance around the Essene way of life. So the sectarian texts belong just to the Essene community, but again, not just to one, because there are contradicting traditions and contradicting views. Now, when you look at all of these different texts, ranging from the Judaic legal text to a biblical interpretation, historical interpretation, to the sectarian text, inspirational poetic texts, and self-help books, one on the left to assume that this was a compilation of libraries, that it would be very unlikely for one community to produce that range of knowledge to be preserved in the Qumran caves. But yet, which libraries, that to be known. Just to mention other documents that were found in the caves, those are not scrolls and not scripts, but nonetheless of importance. There was a number of letters saved in the caves, actually military letters. There was an archive of one individual called the Archive of Babata. There was also archive of letters between various thinkers of the time in Palestine. And there are some documents that alleged to belong to the Qumran caves, but most likely they were just scribbles on the back of the pages that were not related to the preservation of the documents. Now, concluding all of this very rich description of what is out there, why do we even talk about it? What relevance does it have to Theosophical movement and to Theosophy? So that's the key question, because today we didn't really focus on the Gnosticism and how it relates to the Theosophical movement, or actually not relates, how it is basically the one of the threads of the wisdom religion that continue till today. The enormous significance of importance of the Qumran find for Theosophical movement is that it shows the pluralism of religions and philosophical thought in the time, that brings it together in the beautiful patchwork of wisdom religion. That it brings the text from the wisdom religion that existed at the time, that was stripped from that pluralism and left as a very bare Christianity or Islamic tradition that no longer had a connection to the wisdom religion. When you look at what is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, again, 7 languages, There is influence of Zoroastrians, there is Arabic influence, there is a Judaic, there is a Pythagorean, there is Eastern, and there is a newly Christian. So there is a heritage of the masters, and there is a linkage that is being lost later. So this is really one of the most enormous discoveries of history archaeology in terms of the religious scripts that bring back to us the understanding of the pluralism and the wisdom religion, the way it existed and got lost between the 3rd century, we talked about it, between about 3rd century and today. So it does show us basically what existed in terms of religious thought and how religious debate was conveyed at the time before all pluralism and inquiry was basically extinguished by the new Christian faith. The another significance and importance of this is that it gives us insight into the true nature of Jesus, of him being one of the masters who had that connection to the wisdom religion. And we will talk more during the next talk about him. But this is the very important point that we see in the Qumran scrolls. Jesus belongs to a Judaic tradition. He is not part of a new religion. He belongs to the Judaic, Zoroastrian, Pythagorean, Eastern tradition, Therapeutite. There is a connection between all of these schools of thought. Now, what happens later? To separate Christianity from the wisdom religion, the only way it can be done, Jesus is taken out of the context and made a God. And with that, there is actually by making Jesus a God, there is a breakage with the wisdom religion, with the great master, breakage of lineage, and creation of something unnatural and separate. So this is the first separation. So to separate Christianity, Jesus made a God, and it becomes a whole new religion, and in a way defining thought of modernity. Meanwhile, the Jesus that belonged to the Dead Sea Scrolls and Judaic tradition and carried the heritage of the wisdom religion is lost, doesn't exist. This is the biggest difference between the Jesus of the Dead Sea Scrolls and what Dead Sea Scrolls show us of him, and what the Christianity talks about him now, how they portray it. So this is introduction to the next talk on true nature of Jesus in December. But between the next talk, there will be yet another next Sunday meeting and the Sunday discussions. But this will be sort of to conclude the Gnostic tradition and conversation about its relevance to the Theosophical movement and true meaning of Christianity. So I will conclude at that if there are any questions.
Sounds like you have under, if you will, a gold mine of information. And I think you hit on it very effectively in the talk, as much as you can in one talk, but it seems like a lot more to go. You said you were going to talk about it in December when you talk about the real Jesus. And it seems like we may need to have another talk next quarter. We'll see how that one goes. But,
We've actually discussed that just before the talk because I was asked, would I talk about this and that? And I said, I actually know I could not contain all of this. And this and that was the basically going deep in the Gnostic Gospels and sort of comparing the Theosophy and the Gnostic Gospels and similarity of the three fundamentals of Theosophy and the Gnostic Gospels. So maybe we indeed do that talk as well. So that's where we really go deep into the more of spiritual matters of dissension and unity with the Theosophical movement.
sounds like you also brought out a lot about Theosophy in your talk, implied a lot of things. So it would, it's going to be interesting to run what I want to add in the next future quarters.
Definitely, there just the more I've been looking into the topic, the more there is mysteries. That at some point I would probably recommend to everyone. There's a wonderful book that I went back and forth. It's Dead Sea Scrolls. It's about the Dead Sea Scrolls and their discovery. There are many other books, but what I would really like to do myself and recommend to everyone is to go to the Gospels themselves. They are astonishing. They are shocking. They are incomprehensible. But unless we go to the scriptures themselves, every interpretation, as we know, is just interpretation. So maybe indeed next talk we'll go straight to the Gospels and the original text and discuss that. Thank you.
Question, were any of the scrolls, sorry, go ahead, Herb.
No, I was gonna see, change the subject. You go, Osiris.
Okay, question is, were any of the scrolls written before Christ?
They are dated between, once again, our dating analysis is still not perfect. They're dated between 100 BC and 70 AD. They are somewhere there. No one can say, was it 10 AD or was it 20 BC? It still, we don't have the technology to do that. So very possible. There is actually debate about that possibly many scrolls were written somewhere 50 before Christ, 70 before Christ. All they could determine that it is written somewhere between these 2 centuries, basically 1 century, 50 to about 70. Originally, why there were these battles of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the analysis could show only 700 years span. So we could only say it was within this 700 years, and that was really questioning lots of things. Now we are within 100. Unfortunately, and this is sort of from my reading on the archaeology, unfortunately, our carbon dating will be further impacted. It's actually going to get worse. And this is because of the ozone and the climate change. But it's not getting more precise, it's getting less precise, and we do need to find some other dating methodology. So we're not going to get closer with carbon dating to understanding the exact years of Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a very good question. We don't know.
You probably will cover this next time too. But you mentioned SMEs.
Essence.
Jesus was he taught? He was taught by them. Right?
Yes, yeah. Jesus not only was taught by them, he was born in the Essen community. I think it was, I don't know, his uncle who was Essen. He grew up in the Essen community. He was part of it.
Question: how would our perspective be different if they had not been discovered?
Fortunately, there were some other discoveries. So there was a Pistis Sophia that was discovered in the 1700s. So we talked about Pistis Sophia. And there were, again, interpretation of the Gnostics through the debates of their opponents. So there was a big piece of knowledge missing of understanding of both Gnosticism and the various traditions in the period. We did know about the other schools of thought, and especially from the opponents of Gnostics and the Gnostic schools, we knew about the main ideas behind them, that they did carry the influence of Pythagorean schools, Zoroastrian schools, of other wisdom religions, but there was not enough evidence, not enough material to work with. The material here really gives a lot to work, especially the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary. Those are the Gospels that, in a way, shockingly show a whole different side of Christianity. And something that I haven't mentioned that's also very important, when the sectarian texts were read, sectarian texts were very different to the mainstream Christians, because the mainstream Christians had a firm belief that it is their duty on earth. They are the sort of the God anointed, appointed people to bring Christianity to the world. The sectarian scripts of the essence in the Qumran's caves actually quite opposite. There is no intent. They actually want to preserve them as original, and they are not attempting to bring it to the world and proselytize and convert everyone. So this more hints that this was esoteric Christianity. That was sort of the knowledge of the few. While the mainstream Christianity was more exoteric, and they were sort of possessed with the idea of bringing it to the entire world. Well, Essence completely did not care about that. Their job was not to proselytize and bring it to the world. Their job was to preserve, to recover, preserve, and ensure that this wisdom exists in the ages. So very different purposes. So we would lose probably esoteric side of Christianity if not for the Dead Sea Scrolls and Nag Hammadi library. But of course, we still had Pistis Sophia, and we had the debates of the opponents between the mainstream Christians and the Gnostics.
Question is Aramaic and Hebrew, are they two different languages? Did one lead from the other?
My understanding was actually, I'll show you, there is a wonderful, it will be a good demonstration. They are somewhat related, but there are certain differences. This was quite interesting. I want to really find this page, so I'll show you this page. Unfortunately, the book is falling apart, but we'll find the page. It compares all the languages. There it is. I literally going page by page. That is separate. Yes, I found the page. You can see. So this is comparison of the alphabet. It is similar. It is somewhat similar. I would say it's almost like comparing all of the Francophone languages or all the Latin-based languages. There are differences, but there were some similarities. And it's interesting to see that there was Aramaic, and it seemed that Aramaic would take a form of the region where it was spoken. So there will be the Hebrew Aramaic, there will be Christian Aramaic. What's interesting that the Christian Aramaic was wasn't called like the Roman Aramaic, because most of the Christians would be pagans. So there would be more neighboring tribes and the Roman Empire itself. So those Christian Aramaic, then there was the Nabatean Aramaic and Arabic. So Aramaic was sort of like this root language with the various interpretations or dialects. That's sort of my rough understanding.
Just the book you used, the page numbers.
32 and 33 pages, and the meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls by Powell Davis.
What's the title of the book? What's the title of the book?
Dead Sea Scrolls. The meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay, thank you.
It is older book. It's really a book. This is something that I would say I always do studying the ancient scriptures. I would read books that were published at the time of discovery and the books that are more modern, because then you can see the progression of the thoughts and theories about them. But I always like to look at the original book. So this is one of the original books published right after discovery of the Qumran scrolls, 1956. And then you update it with all of the modern knowledge and all the new theories that came up. But this is basically written at the time of discovery. Indeed, a very fascinating topic. Okay, no more questions.
We've got a few minutes left. Any more questions?
One more. How long did the Essenes live for? What is their time of existence, so to speak?
I believe the first records come about 3rd century BC, and they disappear. Basically, they've been dislocated from their land by the Christians. They were driven in exile in Egypt, in Persia, so they had to leave Palestine. And some communities, I believe the only remaining communities still exist in Iran that descend from the essence. But they disappear also, I would say around, I guess around 5th century. That's when there's less and less of a record of the essence once they're driven from the Palestine and exiled in various places. But they're still in existence, and there is a community in Iran that still continues the lineage of practicing the essence belief. It may be very mixed with Zoroastrians. I don't know. It would be quite interesting to see.
Sounds like there's a lot of that predated Jesus. The time that it's said that he lived. Were there references to him in all the literature?
There are references to him. Of course, there is not one reference that there is the new God has been born. No. There are references to him as one of the thought leaders, as one of the mystics, basically someone who was belonging to the essence. He is associated with the essence in the records, but he is fully part of the Judaic tradition. He is not creating a new religion of anything of the sorts. But of course, there is, and we talked more about also about the Judaic traditions of the time, that some of them did not recognize his teachings and his interpretation, not even teaching, his interpretation of the Bible. So they were considering him quite sort of off and not significant, and at times threatening. So even after his death, that would be like basically there was this strange person who talked nonsense and they got killed and that's it. But then the others who found him, especially, and from Essen tradition, why he was mentioned, because he was part of the Essen tradition. So he was familiar. This was the ideas that he shared were not novel. They were based on the Essen beliefs that were based on Pythagorean beliefs and the Zoroastrian beliefs were based on wisdom religion. So it was not revolutionary new. So he was more accepted and understood in the Essen community. And then, of course, there were this new branch of the Christians who decided that this is the chance to basically proclaim him to be a god and bringing us the good news and the new message, and condemn to damnation everyone who does not believe. What else works more effectively than eternal damnation? So that was the beginning of the demise. The loss of the wisdom religion in Christianity. And again, the most significant part is that it is the philosophical view that still dominates the Western world. That we are not free of it, it's not a history. And the challenges we create, the dogmas that we profess, the worldviews that we uphold are based on that misconception.
So it is said that the historical Jesus is basically absent. The biblical Jesus, and now we have the Dead Sea Scrolls references to him. So provides additional basis for not only the ancient teachings, but also how he fits in the ancient teachings. That period.
Great. Well, thank you so much for everyone for joining, and those who are in the room will continue with the coffee communion and continue discussing the scrolls.
We're looking forward to the first Sunday in December. I forget which it's.
Yeah, first Sunday in December. That's
The
the appropriate
continuation of
month.
this, and possible continuation of this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now,
Bye.
let me ask this before we